The Sikh Human Rights Group proudly presents our Environmental and Diversity Speaker Series. Today's topic, how to save our planet from human-made destruction. Today you'll be listening to Professor Ilan Kelman, a Professor of Disaster and Health at the University College London in England, and a Professor at the University of Agder in Kristiansand, Norway. His overall research interest is linking disasters and health, including the integration of climate change into disaster research and health research. This covers three main areas: disaster diplomacy and health diplomacy, island sustainability involving safe and healthy communities in isolated locations, and risk education for health and disasters. Recorded live on the 13th of October 2021, this is the 9th podcast in Sikh Human Rights Group's 2021 Environmental and Diversity Speaker Series. Welcome, Ilan, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for all the work you're doing.
You're most welcome. Ilan, could I please ask you to begin by telling our audience a little bit about the invaluable environmental protection work that you and your colleagues have done in the past and are currently undertaking?
Sure, happy to do so. I mean, we certainly hope it's valuable. And what we try and do is always have a science focus, an evidence focus. So we are a university, and we're actually the top university in the UK for research at the moment, and we're hoping to try and keep that position. So we try and produce world-leading, exciting, innovative research exactly for what you mentioned in terms of supporting environmental protection, environmental education, environmental action. We then bring that to the classroom. So we have a very vibrant PhD program. We have dozens of PhD students covering all sorts of topics and disciplines, from tourism to supporting people in their health to reducing the risk of disasters. We also have several master's programs in global health, in health economics, in reducing disasters, and in resilience. And this year, we have just started a Bachelor of Science in Global Humanitarian Studies to try and bring students just out of secondary school into the humanitarian realm. We take research-based teaching. So we are often bringing to the classroom, running modules, running courses, running sessions, which are actually about our ongoing research, what we have done, so it's unique in the world, trying to instill in the students the ability to challenge us, to question us, to have critiquing, independent thinking, to go out into the world and say, hang on, that doesn't look quite right. What if we did it this way in a constructive manner? And then the third element is just working with people. So we do a lot of media work, which can be very stressful, very intensive. Certainly talking to the public a lot. Thank you for this opportunity for the podcast to really check, what I say, does it make sense? What I'm doing, does it make sense? Can I actually show the world what science and science education is? Encourage them to engage with us as researchers and to engage with universities and ensure that what we are doing is really serving the public. And that's where we love feedback. So I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn. Anyone can please join me, connect with me, critique me, constructively, I hope, and looking forward to improving, because unfortunately we do find that there's a lot of nastiness out there, and what we try and do with our science-based and evidence-based approach is reduce the nastiness, bring in kindness, but kind critique, constructive critique. We all make mistakes. We can all do better and should do better, and that's where we do need that interaction. We do need that feedback, whether with other scientists, with our students, or just with the general public, ordinary people who want to do better regarding these environmental issues that you mentioned.
Thank you very much, Ilan. That was extremely insightful. Dr. Rai, could I please ask you to briefly introduce yourself and Sikh Human Rights Group's environmental policies?
I'm Jasdev Singh Rai, Director of Sikh Human Rights Group. We were formed in 1985 formally and worked on mostly on human rights issues in the Punjab for a long time in India. But then after 93, we diversified. We participated in the 2001 the Johannesburg Conference on Sustainable Development. And started taking a keen interest. One of the issues we introduced was to look at how different faiths connect with the environment. because we think that faith communities and faith institutions often tend to influence people far more than governments and politicians and even scientists to some extent. But they are almost out of the picture due to the quite, I think, perhaps more fundamentally secularism that started in the 60s and 70s. Yet their influence can have a valuable effect on how people engage with the environment. So I think it became a big thing. We were not able to engage with the UN much longer because we didn't have a status. Even in 2015, we managed to get consultative status. And our approach is that a lot of civilizations have some very profound ideas on the human relation with the environment. And many cultures around the world have rituals and practices, which are, in fact, when you try and analyze them scientifically, they make sense. It's just that they're not presented in the formal science terminology that we are used to in the West. And that we need to try and encourage these pluralistic approaches so that people around the world are more connected with, not only connected with, but take ownership of the environment. Because currently what we see is that there's a great deal of enthusiasm in the ordinary people in the West, but in the rest of the world, there is a sense of apathy in the people, although states are engaged and educated people are engaged, but the rest of the population often doesn't tend to have that much passionate, let's say, concerns about the environment because they feel disconnected. Their language, their culture, their way of approach is not being reconnected with the environmental issues. And that's why we're very interested in hearing a lot of the different perspectives, the different concerns. And we then also want to bring in different actors from different cultures as well and see how they can look at this and get their people to be more engaged with this whole thing. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're going to begin today's discussion, panelists, by delving into a variety of prominent environmental questions. I'm then going to give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Bethan Walters, who will ask you a few questions on diversity and inclusion related matters. So Ilan, my first question for you is, in your opinion, what are the greatest challenges that our global community faces when it comes to combating and redressing climate change and or achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by 2030? And how, in your opinion, can they be overcome?
Actually, the greatest challenge is coming together in terms of recognizing what we do have available, what we can and should do, and actually moving forward with action. So we have the knowledge, we have the skill, we even have the resources, and yet we're simply not applying it. So the overarching greater challenge is let's do what we know needs to be done. Climate change is definitely part of that and has to be, but it is only a subset within many wider topics, such as disasters, such as wider sustainability, such as dealing with environment. Same with the Sustainable Development Goals. We have many problems with them. They do not go as far as they ought to. So really the challenge is going beyond and doing better than the Sustainable Development Goals. One specific example is that Target 8.1 says that the least developing countries need to increase their GDP 7% each year. GDP measures consumption of resources. If we want a good proportion of the world's countries to substantially increase 7% a year, their consumption, we're not doing very well by the environment, and we're certainly not going to support climate change. When I say that we have the resources, we have the money, that's because a huge proportion of expenditure is going to the military to kill people. We're looking at about $2 trillion a year. A good proportion of money is going to subsidize fossil fuels. Direct, currently about $140 to $150 billion a year, although usually it's $400 to $500 billion a year. Indirect is about 10 times that amount. So whereas now people are saying we need $100 billion a year to support climate change action, that's actually spare change compared to the money that we spend to create climate change. And then there is at least $1 trillion and perhaps $2 or $3 trillion a year in illicit financial flows from poorer countries to richer countries. That is illegally transferring money and resources from the countries that can least afford it to places like the UK and elsewhere who can afford it. So we have the money. The challenge is, how do we get that money away from killing people to help people? How do we get that money away from illegal transfers to legal ways of helping those who need it? How do we get that money away from creating climate change and disaster risk to supporting disaster risk reduction and actually stopping climate change? And the SDGs just don't address this aspect in detail, as well as other concerns. So to me, the challenge is we have the knowledge. The current frameworks, like the Sustainable Development Goals, like the climate change negotiations, cannot achieve what we need. So let's come together, let's do better, let's go beyond the 2030 agenda and beyond the international meetings, which takes up so much resources, and really say we all have so much to contribute, some more than others. You know, not everyone is a billionaire. I'm certainly not even close. But even those who are the poorest of the poorest have knowledge, have passion, have ideas. And so that greatest challenge is coming together to tackle climate change, to implement sustainable development, to do so much more, and really saying we have these international frameworks, we have these documents, but we need to go beyond them. We need to do so much better with everyone, particularly those who are typically marginalized and are typically the ones not transferring the billions or the trillions of dollars into realms which cause harm, which cause problems.
Thank you very much, Ilan. That was extremely thorough. Dr. Rai, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think you, Ilan, has explained it really well. I think we totally agree with you. There's been too much focus on the GDP in the whole international community, at the UN and the World Bank, that every little village in even the remotest place must have a road and lights and things like that, and must have a good standard of living, without looking at the wider consequences on where the material is going to come from, how much damage that will do to the environment, and where are we going to end up with the lack of depletion of resources and change of lifestyles. I think there needs to be a refocusing of many of the aims of the United Nations, particularly in light of two things. One is the development. What constitutes development? Is development just GDP and lifestyle changes at every little village in the world needs to look a bit like London, have the amenities of London, or or should we look at countries like Bhutan, which seems to be quite happy, and people seem to have, I think, the highest, among the highest happiness index there. Secondly, I think they have to be looked in terms of human rights, or rather responsibilities and duties. I think the Human Rights Council recently at the UN resolved that the right to environment and clean air is a human rights. So, well, that will be interesting how they then integrate that into many of the other institutions of the United Nations, such as the WTO, and the right to development. How do they integrate that into that? But you're absolutely right. I think it's a matter of the world community, not the international community, because the international community is normally USA, UK, Europe, and that sort of thing. The world community, meaning the ordinary people, coming together and taking ownership, becoming more connected, finding solutions, finding ways forward, and realizing that there is an alternative lifestyle, and we have to we have to preserve what we have. Yeah, completely with you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. Ilan, I don't know if you want to respond to that, or we can move on to the next question.
No, absolutely articulated, and I would very much emphasize what was said. It's not just about rights, but it's about duties and responsibilities. They go together, they combine, and we need to recognize that we all have the rights mentioned. We also have duties and responsibilities which match those and which need to be dealt with together.
Wonderful. So, panelists, my next question for you is what lessons, Ilan, have you taken away from your research with small island nations that can inform us about the most effective methods to mitigate and adapt to the negative impacts of climate change, both in terms of the physical effects and the governance gaps that are currently persisting around the globe?
Key lesson is we all have so much to contribute. I have learned so much from just watching and talking to fishers and farmers. Of course, there's people who have technical expertise also, whether it's the water engineer, whether it's the prime minister. So the key lesson is coming together, learning from each other, exchanging, teaching each other in order to say, well, what do I need? What's useful for me, but what do other people need? What's useful for them? What emerges is that focusing on climate change only can be a really significant and unfortunate distraction. We should never ignore climate change. It is a big issue. It is a major issue. We are rapidly and substantively changing the climate. There is no doubt, and there are major knock-on effects which we have to deal with. But there are also wider contexts within which climate change sits. So you mentioned climate change mitigation. That refers to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and taking them up, more uptake of the emissions. That's basically pollution prevention. And we have worked on trying to stop pollutants for decades, whether it's at the source by sort of scrubbing them out of emissions or just not producing them in the first place, which is actually key to climate change. And again, there's so many local solutions looking at local biofuels and also just reducing the use of energy, which we can implement in our day-to-day lives. So climate change mitigation sits within pollution prevention. But unfortunately, we forced ourselves onto a trajectory where human-caused climate change is changing the weather now, is changing the environment now, and we're going to see a lot more. So we do have to adjust to these impacts, which the word is adaptation, climate change adaptation. There is nothing new in climate change adaptation. We've been doing this for the 10,000 years of modern humanity. And it sits very well within addressing disaster risk, wider health aspect, wider rights aspects, wider sustainability. So it's all very well to have this complicated vocabulary, but let's draw on from the fishers I spoke to, from the taxi drivers I spoke to, from the prime ministers and technical experts who come from the islands as well as many other places. Again, we all have so much to contribute. We all have so much to learn. Let's not create separation saying climate change is here and other topics are here. No, let's join together. Let's join forces. Let's come together and ensure that we do not create more problems by trying to solve one, but instead draw on the resources, knowledge, power, and passion which have existed for 10,000 years, with different degrees of successes, but do better than the failures, bounce off the successes, and do what we need to do to help ourselves by helping each other.
Thank you very much, Ian. If I may, I just ask you one follow-up question. Are there any specific examples of your work with small island nations that you think could be transferable to large cities such as London or Manchester, for that matter?
Yeah, and they're all very specific. So we were very fortunate to see one example in Seychelles, where a coast was eroding quite badly. It was potentially taking out a major road, and then there were houses on the other side of the road. So they took a look at it and then said, okay, well, we do have to, shore up the shoreline, but how can we do this in a way which supports other aspects? So it's not just throwing down a wall and saying, oh, look, there's a huge wall. We've stopped the shoreline erosion. What they did is they actually used local wood to build a very attractive seawall. They didn't make it a straight line, but made it curved by taking into account the ocean currents and the waves, and turned the protected land into a very small park, a picnic area. So it protected the road, it protected the houses, it created a recreational area, and it actually slotted right into the local environment. Now, small island country, there's about 70, 80,000 people, compared to London, the greater area of which is 10 million people, and it draws on a wider area of equivalent. How does this apply? London has so many green spaces, tiny little commons, tiny little parkettes. How can we keep those, use them to ensure that we don't degrade the environment more, but actually make them as safe places which draw out pollution, provide shade, and provide recreation? It's simply taking the principle that a small tract of land can have a big influence for a country, for a wider area. It's saying that it's not about just paving over things, throwing down concrete, putting up walls, but recognizing that all of the objectives can be met in tandem.
Thank you.
So what can and should London do regarding this idea of green spaces, such as along the River Thames? So that's equivalent to water, but not just with respect to the water. What can we do with green spaces to make them safe, secure, supporting pollution reduction, pollution prevention, and supporting people's day-to-day lives in terms of recreation, physical health, and mental health?
Thank you very much, Ilan. I'm sure we can all take those principles through with us into our daily lives and work. Jasdev, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Well, I have a sort of question in relation to small islands. What is the status of small islands now, and with the climate change and the oceans rising? There is a sort of a whole area of concern at the international level, particularly at the UN, about the future of small islands.
Yeah, so climate change is causing the seas to rise in different ways. And the main ways which we know are happening will lead to a rise by the year 2100 of probably just under 2 meters, or certainly not more than 2 meters. That sea level is actually the maximum which we've experienced over the past 10,000 years. So 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, the sea was about 2 meters higher than today, probably a bit more. And through the main areas of sea level rise, we're not going to see more than that. In that sense, it's not really the sea level rising per se. It's the fact that we've put megacities in places which are at sea level. And we have cultures which have developed on some of these islands over the past 3,000 years, basically at sea level. The real concern is the unknown about the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. If they go, we could be looking at 30, 40, 50 meters of sea level rise. Humanity has never experienced that. And so we are looking at Jakarta, New York, Lagos, many places, including several island countries, being inundated, of course, including large swaths of London. If that happens, we will hopefully know by 2080. It may not be reversible, and we will have 300 to 400 years to deal with it until the full impacts of the sort of 30, 40, 50 meters of sea level rise are really seen. So we do have decades to know about it and then centuries to prepare if it happens. We better start now. And again, this is our decision-making process. So with respect to the islands, if this happens, yes, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Maldives, Marshall Islands, and a few others will have to completely relocate, and we have decades to plan this. I mentioned several cities which will have to be reconfigured. Large parts of Bangladesh, large parts of low-lying coastlines in Louisiana, and many other places will have to work over centuries to change how people live and where they live. So the small islands were actually the first to raise the prospect of this danger. They held a major meeting in Maldives in 1989 about sea level rise. This was a warning to the world in 1989. And yet even today, the full implications are not really being taken into account. So it is complicated, but the islands are leading this. They recognize the challenges, but it's also saying that they have so many resources to pull on. They have so much to offer us. You know, the joke, which may or may not be accurate, is that more people from Tuvalu live in Auckland than in Tuvalu. The point being that islanders migrate. They move anyway, and they have wonderful diasporas around the world to draw on. This is not justifying the destruction of a country. No one wants the destruction of these cultures, but it does show that they're not these poor, hapless, hopeless, innocent people fleeing their land. They're actually human beings with knowledge, wisdom, resources, and ideas who need some help, need some support. And so depending what happens with the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets, depending what happens with sea level rise over coming decades, let's learn from them, let's listen to them regarding what they need and to support the aspects we want to keep while helping them move forward into sort of what we have in the world today that we can offer them. So it becomes learning and exchange, with the islanders then telling us Londoners what we might need to do in 2150, 2250 and beyond.
So can I ask a follow-up question on that? The rise of the ocean level and the Antarctica, the ice there melting, well, one of the effects is of the deep sea, which has acted as a reservoir for both carbon and heat. Is it too late, or do you think there is still a possibility, because the deep sea reservoir sort of works in decades, if not hundreds of years? And is that heat release now too late to stop? Too late to stop what is going to happen in Antarctica? I know you said it's an area that we don't quite know, but yeah, your comments will be useful.
Yeah, particularly today, one of the major aspects of sea level rise is the ocean absorbing the extra heat from the atmosphere. That's called thermal expansion, and that's the sea level rise we will see over coming decades. That is effectively irreversible. The Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets melting, we don't yet know. If it starts, it is probably irreversible, and that's where we will know in several decades whether it's happening, and then it will take several centuries to complete. So these physical impacts are going on, and they are very difficult to stop, at least over the time frame of decades. You know, if we stopped pollution emissions today, things would get back by the end of the century, at least to some extent. This happens within the context that the environment is always changing and the climate is always changed. So there's all sorts of variations, trends, which are ongoing. You know, nothing is ever really normal with the climate. What is definitely a problem is the fact that our activities are changing it rapidly and substantively. So that's the issue. What we can do, what is never inevitable, is bad impacts. So even with the sea rising centimeters per decade, even with the atmospheric temperature rising degrees per decade, that will take a long time to deal with in terms of the physical impacts. If we act now locally and internationally, we can stop people dying, we can deal with the adverse impacts. So that's where, yeah, I mean, the deep sea is really an unknown. The ocean circulation, often called the Gulf Stream, is part of it, but more scientifically, thermohaline circulation is unknown. The oceans are also absorbing excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide plus water in the ocean leads to acid. The oceans are becoming more acidic from human-caused climate change. The impacts are unknown. It may take out coral reefs. It may not. It may substantially exacerbate shoreline erosion. It may not. It may harmfully impact mangroves and other coastal ecosystems. It may not. We just don't know. Ocean acidification right now is not reversible, at least on decades, but being ready for scenarios, being ready for the possible impacts and the huge range in terms of the unknowns, is, of course we can do it and we should do it. The challenge is we're not, because we're spending too much money on weapons, we're spending too much money on illegal transfers, we're spending too much money on fossil fuel subsidies. So yeah, physical changes, hard to undo by the end of the century. Adverse human impacts, let's do it, it's up to us, we can.
Looking at, for let's say, from playing the devil's advocate, if a few islands did go down, and let's say with humanitarian aid, people are relocated, is there what consequences does that have on our general world, apart from people being relocated, being refugees? If these islands do go down, is there a great loss? I mean, do we? How do the islands sell their importance to the rest of the world community?
Yeah, no, I mean, I know you're being completely devil's advocate because I know you can answer this question better than I can, coming from the rights-based approach and obviously wanting to support humanity. And people will say, you know what, it's only a city, it's only a country, it's only a culture, who cares? But the fundament is what you have devoted your life to, really human rights, as well as the duties and responsibilities. So human beings are migrants. We always have been, and particularly islanders. This does not justify forced migration. The key has actually always been to give people the opportunities, the resources, the power, and the choices to fulfill their lives and to have appropriate livelihoods and opportunities. And if they choose to move, if they choose to migrate, of course. But to tell someone, too bad your home is gone, that really is inhuman. And even where it's one person or one island or one country or one culture, that degrades us all as human beings. So yes, earthquakes happen, volcanic eruptions happen. People will have to move, areas get destroyed. The key for humanitarian aid, which you mentioned, is not degrading people further, ensuring they are able to deal with the change and that they are able to deal with the new circumstances. Again, it goes back to what I said, that the environment has always been changing. Humans are dynamics. What we've set up is structures which does not give people duties and responsibilities, and which actually undermines their rights. So they do become poor people fleeing and claiming refugee status. They do become completely lost in terms of education, health, social services, and the faith which you promote, because they're treated as less than subhuman, thrown into camps without resources, or told, oh, you know, we don't care about you, just settle here and don't worry about it. So the loss of one affects everyone. But I know that you can answer this question much better. And please, from your perspective, tell us, what does it matter if we lose one person, one home, one culture, one island, one country?
I think you're right that we have a common responsibility towards everyone, and to ensure that every community, culture, and even small islands survive and are not, and we don't bear the burden of them having to relocate or become permanent migrants somewhere else, or permanent refugees somewhere else. They have developed very beautiful sort of ways of life. And it is from a human rights perspective, yes, there is a responsibility on everyone that we need to preserve them, yes.
And not just survive, but thrive.
Right.
Because migration is fine. Mobility is fine. It's when there's no choice and it becomes forced that people get hurt. And even those like us who may not be forced to migrate from the Pacific, it affects us because we lose a part of humanity.
Thank you very much. My next question is, in your expert opinion, panelists, what should ordinary or non-expert members of our global society do when they think newly enacted environmental policies or laws are unethical, unjust, or simply don't go far enough to prevent displacement and so on? And Ilan, if I could ask you to go first.
Actually, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think, there are some, we've seen in UK, there have been some dramatic steps taken by some people by closing down roads and motorways, etc., to try and force governments to change. I think a better way would be, now that democracy is quite widespread in the world, even if there are democratic autocrats in some countries. Even large countries like China, etc., which don't have democracy, are conscious about not the feelings, but the will of the people to some extent. I think if ordinary people were both educated and reconnected, either through their cultures or through their lifestyles, etc., with the environment, they would use that power more effectively to ensure that governments enact policies which are environmentally friendly rather than destructive. I think there is perhaps also still a misconception among many people who have placed a lot of trust in science, that the people in white coats will find a solution so they don't have to do anything. I think that perception has also got to be removed, and say that there may be solutions in science, but scientists are not there yet, and they could take a few centuries. By that time, we'll all be not be surviving with the climate change, and that humanity has to take responsibility, and humanity takes responsibility not only at the individual level, but also at the collective level in state policies. And I think that's what I would say. So there needs to be more awareness, and not only awareness. I think people are aware, but how people can take action. I think that's the next step in the awareness raising. Yeah.
I'm curious. I have a follow-up question on that. You sort of mentioned difficulties with people blocking roads and potentially using approaches which could be construed as involving violence. In terms of civil disobedience, if we feel that our democratic leaders are simply not listening and not really following the democratic will, what's your view on civil disobedience? Thank you.
Well, I think civil disobedience is sometimes the last resort. I mean, in fact, in most of the theories of the state, people who wrote the early theories, even Hobbes did and others did, when giving that power to the state, that if the state then becomes oppressive or brutal or insensitive, then people have to rise up against it. And yes, there is it's in international law as well, in international instruments. It's there in the United States Constitution as well. The right to bear arms in the American Constitution is precisely as one of the Secretary of State of United States defended it, saying, what if the state becomes oppressive? The militias then can rise against it. So they have a very, it's not something that the Europeans would accept, but that is the rationale of the right to bear arms in the United States. But on a more level, we're not talking about people taking up arms against the state. We're talking about civil disobedience, which is what led to some of the independence movements in the decolonization process, And if now the biggest threat to us is the climate, the environmental destruction, where countries are competing with each other to rise in the GDP stakes, then people have to, yes, take direct action through maybe closing down roads or standing outside government buildings, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really using hierarchy and approach that first try within the law.
Yeah.
Laws can be unethical, can be unjust,
Yeah.
but first try and change them. You know, we're so fortunate to live in a democratic country, and doing this podcast, we don't have a fear that there'll suddenly be a knock on the door at night and people dragging us away. And we should be using that privilege to challenge what isn't working in a very lawful and democratic manner. So stand for political office. Constructively challenge our elected representatives, use the media. But as you said, there can be Democrat autocrats, or these procedures may not work. And so within the hierarchy, maybe it does require legal demonstrations. Maybe it does require legal direct action. But then there is that sort of next step. At what point do you break the law precisely because the law violates a constitutional mandate, even within the UK, which becomes civil disobedience? For me, forms of violence are too far down the slippery slope. And there are many different forms of violence, direct or indirect. On the other hand, the response is, well, what would I have done at the beginning of World War II? What would I do when the authorities do use violence against others? And it's a hard question. And I can absolutely see myself in circumstances where very reluctantly, very sadly, unfortunately, as you said, picking up an arm might be the way forward. What I would hope is we never get to that step. The sad reality is that humans are very talented at getting to that step very quickly. And it's a real philosophical, practical dilemma in terms of at what stage do we bring in violence, and then how do we even justify it? So I would hope that we never reach that we try within the law, we try within democracy. When law and democracy do become unethical and unjust, it's difficult, it's murky, and it's very, very hard.
Well, the good thing is that the law, has been supporting civil disobedience. I think both in the United States and this country, and we've seen civil disobedience for other issues in India. The Supreme Court has upheld their right. The UN has upheld their right. Governments don't like it. Sometimes people going about their business don't like it. But it's a legitimate way forward. And I think, if it is going to draw attention, not only attention, but change in policy, then perhaps that's where we are.
And how do you help and support people who don't have our privilege of democracy and the ability to be outspoken and to really conduct constructive civil disobedience? How do we help those living in other regimes?
Yeah, my feeling is that there is no such thing as an absolute autocrat. Even autocrats have to remain in power with sort of compromises with other powers in the state. So there are other powerful people and forces in the state. And those forces, for instance, have to, again, are dependent on many ordinary people. So it may not be an institutionalized democracy as we have. It may not be institutionalized, devolution of power as we have. But most surviving autocratic regimes are dependent on other powerful forces within the state who are dependent on people. And and I think this is what we are seeing in China, that the Chinese government is seeing the mood of the people is turning towards protecting the environment, with seeing all the disasters, and the government is beginning to respond to that. Now, ironically, I think it's sometimes in democracies where more abuse takes place because a government comes in to a democratic process, and for instance, our government has come with in the UK, it's got an 80-seat majority, and then it feels it's above reproach. Under the Conservative Party itself then takes a different approach and on the government, put some shackles on it. There isn't much people can do for another 4 or 5 years because the government, the whole process is legitimized. We voted him, the government in, therefore the government can do what it wants. Whereas in other countries, the dynamics is sometimes continuous. There are checks and balances. I think the more the common person around the world becomes aware and concerned, even dictatorships respond. That's my opinion anyway, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roy. My next question is, panelists, my final question. Is there one small thing that we could all adopt into our daily routines that would significantly help to mitigate and adapt to the negative impacts of climate change? And Ilan, if I could ask you to go first.
Learn and do what you can. Everyone can do something. Everyone can contribute something. No one can take the entire burden on themselves. So if appropriate, maybe it's giving up a private vehicle or retaining a private vehicle, but just walking double the distance as usual. Maybe it's using the resources we have, like a laptop, like an online environment, to get involved in social media and try and influence politicians. And yeah, of course, we're using resources like rare earth metals and electricity. But again, you've asked what is one small thing that can be done. And every letter to a politician makes a difference. Every time we simply talk one-on-one to an individual to learn from them and to give them information makes a difference. Every time we choose to use less resources, like turning out the lights earlier or driving less or buying less packaging, that can make a difference. So in a sense, it's not about one small thing because nothing is really small. It's really saying, can we take incremental steps fairly rapidly to end up with that big jump? If we say to someone, reduce your electricity by 80% tomorrow, that's hard and quite rightly may yield a very negative reaction. If we say try 10% over the next 2 months, then another 10% over the following 2 months, and another 10% over the following 2 months, accounting for weather variations and different needs, then maybe fairly rapidly we get to that 80%. For people who can afford it, some people do own their own house. What do local solar and wind approaches help in terms of getting off grid, recognizing that there are costs associated with that as well as benefits. So it's really saying, what is our individual situation? How can we act specifically to our own circumstances? And what can we do with a tweet, if anything? What can we do with a letter to an MP, if anything? What can we do about just having a chat with our neighbor, if anything? If that makes a difference, to say, look, here's what we can do locally. Here's what we can do internationally. Here's what we need to do day to day. Here's what we need to do generation to generation. Everyone is different. Everyone has different resources. No action is particularly small. Let's come together to add up the small ones to make it big, while also being aware that, I've said a few times, the military is absolutely destroying the world in more ways than just weapons. Fossil fuel subsidies are simply excessive in terms of money, and there's so much resources floating around, which people are hoarding, keeping for themselves, illegally transferring. So we do need ways forward in terms of tackling these big issues at the same time as doing these local individual steps, bit by bit, to live healthier, more fulfilling, and more sustainable lives.
Thank you very much. Dr. Roy, could I put the same question to you, please?
Yeah, I think it's been put very eloquently, really. And I think on my part, I think what I will say is that perhaps we can start thinking of whatever, when we wake up in the morning, what are the major things that we are doing and how can we reduce our carbon footprint on that? How can we try and adopt an alternative approach? And then gradually, as it becomes part of your lifestyle, you bring it into the smaller things in your life as well. And secondly, to take action and join groups, etc., which are putting pressure on MPs and the government to mitigate, to adopt different policies, which will be more environmental friendly. I think the recent agitations have shown how that despite being a highly developed country, Britain has the highest number of houses which are not very friendly to loss of heat and things like that. And there's too much energy going there, and that energy is coming through fossil fuel, and a bit of insulation, bit of investment in that. Maybe quite a lot, but in the long term will save us a lot of money, a lot of hassle. If 10 years down the line, a lot of people become ill because of the consequences of environmental damage, and the impact on the NHS and the rest of the people is higher. But if you take steps now and start insulating houses and use less energy, that's a much more wiser step. And I think those are movements that we can all not necessarily join if we can't, but at least support and write to our MPs. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rai. I'm now going to give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Bethan Walters, who will ask you a few questions on diversity and inclusion related matters.
Come in.
Hello, thank you very much. Hi, so I think we'll kind of just delve a bit deeper to what you've mentioned before, and I'm sure you're already aware, but Professor Kelman, I was just wondering, so here at Sikh Human Rights Group, we're obviously strong believers that caring for the environment and human rights are mutually inclusive. So in other words, kind of strong believers in the fact that you cannot simply look at climate change in the kind of round and not consider the wider human rights implications or violations. So with that being said, could you please explain to our listeners some of the more experienced human rights that are being violated due to negative effects of climate change?
Yeah, this is so important, and it really brings together a lot of the issues as well as putting climate change in wider context. So when we look at human rights, there are issues like the right to life. If we hurt the environment, that absolutely bounces back to us in terms of hurting us. An unhealthy environment makes us unhealthy, which then violates a right to life. When we're looking at issues of giving people opportunities, resources, livelihoods, and choices regarding that, if the river is polluted, if the ecosystem has been destroyed, if the air is leading to asthma and other respiratory ailments, then their choices are reduced. The kids are forced to stay home from school more, losing out on socialization, losing out on education. People may not have the opportunity to move elsewhere because they cannot afford it. And all of those are part of fundamental human rights. Of course, it's not just the environment for us, because the environment as individual species and as wider ecosystems is also said to have rights. And in a way, then we have to think, well, maybe the environment, maybe animals have duties and responsibilities also. For me, the fundament is that culture is not separate from nature. Human society is not separate from the environment or ecosystems. Even in a megacity like London, we have an urban ecosystem, and I mentioned earlier the green spaces. Obviously, humans have modified it for 2,000 years, if not more, but there's still plenty of animals, there's still plenty of plants, it still is an ecosystem. And we're modifying it through human-caused climate change already. So it's not about saying, oh, well, nature is pristine and we have to keep it natural and keep them separate. No, It's about saying we live with the environment, we live in the environment affects us. And so, yes, we do have rights and duties and responsibilities. If we are not fully integrated into the environment, if that environment is not healthy, it means we are not healthy. And so all of these basic rights like education, health, opportunity, and livelihoods actually end up becoming violated, as well as environmental rights also becoming violated.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rai, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think it's increasingly now becoming obvious that the right to a clean air, the right to a good environment is a human right. It was interesting that it was a very interesting judgment in the Supreme Court of India about 25 years ago, when there was a lot of pollution from the big trucks and many old vehicles. The Supreme Court judge there, who came to be known as the Green Judge, was quite disappointed with what the government was, or the inaction of the government. And a case came in front of him, and he said the right to clean air is a human right, and these trucks and everything must change within 3 months. And it wasn't enforced by the government with the judgment coming from the Supreme Court. So he then gave another month to the director of, or the chief of police, and said, if within the next month things are not changed, then you will be in prison. I will direct you to be imprisoned. And then within a month, the whole policy changed. So all the big trucks had to go on CNG and things like that. And there's been a recent judgment here in London as well, where a young girl died with the asthmatic attack and because there was a lot of pollution on the road. I think this is going to become more and more an issue now. I hope human rights lawyers will take it up, and if not through the democratic process, at least through the legal process, force governments to change their policies or pay huge amounts of compensation. I think it's going to be a interesting way forward.
So in fact, you're showing, as challenging and technical as it is, the legal process does have some very poignant successes.
Yep.
Thank you very much, both. That was really insightful. So the next question is, we have seen that in certain parts of the globe, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, which you mentioned earlier, feel the effects of climate change a lot worse than the Northern Hemisphere. We have worked closely with affiliates in South Africa and Brazil who work with locals and their families who have lived on the land for centuries and who are arguably living the most sustainable lives, but yet feel the negative effects of climate change a lot more than those who are living less sustainable lives. So therefore, could you please explain to our listeners why it's so important that the rest of the globe listens to and learns from these otherwise marginalized people?
I mean, for me, it's about listening to each other, learning from each other. Certainly, if we look at the Southern Hemisphere, Australia has had brutal heat waves and wildfires, bushfires, whereas in the Northern Hemisphere, in British Columbia, Oregon, Washington State, California, it's been similar. So it's one planet. We're one species and we're not doing a good job. There are plenty of marginalized peoples in the Arctic, and many Indigenous Arctic communities in Canada have much worse infrastructure and much worse environmental opportunities with rights being violated than even those in informal settlements around megacities near the equator. So it's not about sort of us saying, oh, you poor Southern Hemisphere people, wow, we need to help you. Or, well, you're so marginalized, tell us what you need. It's saying we all have issues and we all have different opportunities and different levels. So let's help each other. Even in London, people have lived here for centuries, as I mentioned, 2,000 years. So things have changed. Again, London has had successes and failures, But with respect to human-caused climate change, it's not looking good. Already, temperatures on the tube exceed 35 degrees Celsius, and some tube lines don't have air conditioning. When we start hitting 40 and 45, even if they do have air conditioning, imagine the power goes out. So not only do the tube trains stop, but there's no air conditioning and you're trapped underground. People in high rises, which, mentioned earlier, also houses which don't have proper insulation. As was discussed, fuel poverty has long been an absolutely horrible situation for many people in London, in England, in the UK. So yeah, absolutely. Indigenous peoples around the world are being slammed by human-caused climate change, lack of democracy, exploitation of resources, human slavery, misappropriation of resources. That also affects us directly. So human-caused climate change is one problem among many we have to tackle. We discussed some approaches earlier. Let's do as much as we can to learn from people, Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in the Amazon, from Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in the Arctic and around the world, from people in informal settlements in Jakarta as well as London, and from people in formal living conditions in Jakarta as well as London, to say, what do we need? What can we offer? How can we work together to help each other and thereby help ourselves?
Thank you very much. That was brilliant. Dr. Rai, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has happened in the past is in the Northern Hemisphere, people have been a bit smug and thinking, well, it's not happening to us, it's just them. But I think it's with the science on clouds, the effect of clouds and the effect of oceans, it is bringing home that what happens in the Southern Hemisphere, it doesn't just stay there. It also comes northwards, and it's affecting the north as well, as you gave some very good examples. And I think if apart from the altruistic need to think collectively, I think there is a necessity of survival that also is influencing people in the north to start taking or being more careful over what they and sees in the south. And I think if there's increasing pressure on them now to start realizing that it doesn't stay in the south, it comes north as well.
And you're absolutely right. There's so much of this attitude of us compared to them. What do you advise to try and overcome this separation?
Yeah.
I think, what would you advise to separate this feeling of us versus them?
I think the us and them is partly a lot grounded in the colonial legacy and racism, but as that is breaking down, people, I think younger generations in the north are becoming increasingly less ethnically exclusivist, less racist, and they see themselves as part of the common humanity. And if I think the science can also influence their decisions by showing that the environment does not selectively affect one race or the other. It doesn't selectively affect one region or the other. It's having an effect throughout the globe. I think more and more of that awareness is creeping in. Yes, there's I think it was obvious in the Brexit decision and the voting pattern that there was an older generation which was very keen for Brexit, whereas the younger generation saw itself part of a common humanity and less exclusivist. And I hope, I think there is hope in the future built on that. That the legacy of colonialism and racism is hopefully dying, and a better understanding is emerging. A better understanding is emerging about our common responsibilities.
Thank you very much, both. I'll pass you over to Carlos now.
Yes, I just have a few concluding remarks. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ryan. Thank you very much, Ilan, for being with us today and taking the time out of your busy schedules. The only remarks I really have is that this podcast has been brought to you by the Sikh Human Rights Group. For more information about Professor Ilan Kelman and the Sikh Human Rights Group's environmental and diversity policies, please visit our website, the link to which can be found within the description to this video. Or alternatively, please visit our Instagram account at SHRG_NGO. I've been Carlos Arbuthnot. Thank you very much for listening.
And thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for all of you for your work. I've learned so much and looking forward to continuing to learn and to exchange.